Hello, and welcome to another virtual author event at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and the Poison Pen is delighted to have with us author Heather Chavez, whose new book is Blood Will Tell. Before we begin, I do want to let those listening in know that we have copies of Heather's books available for purchase, so feel free to give us a call or go online. We'll be happy to hold one for you to pick up or put one in the mail. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Heather.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for visiting us virtually. I'm always fascinated by authors, kind of how they get to where they're at now. I guess you'd call it their origin story. What can you tell us about yourself before you became a novelist?
Well, I've always known that I wanted to write, so I've always written. It wasn't a conscious choice I made so much as just something I did. I was also an avid reader as a child. And, when I read Dean Koontz's The Whispers, I was 11 and I was like, oh, this is what I want to do. I want to write books like this. And who wouldn't? Who wouldn't want to write like Dean Koontz? So I just started then dabbling in like creepy novellas and all these short stories, and realized that genre just was not for me because I had just too much to say. It was hard to rein it in. And I admire anybody who can write a tight short story. And so then I ended up writing a few practice books in my 20s and 30s. I was actually working on the start of my fourth when I had an idea for No Bad Deed, and ended up having to switch gears entirely because I just was struck, and I really knew that was the book that I wanted to write in that moment. And so I did. I threw out that other book, and when I was done with No Bad Deed, with draft, I think 4, I ended up thinking, okay, this might be the book I can actually try to get an agent for. And so I went and started querying. And that's kind of the lead up of my life. I was also tried other things to kind of scratch that creative itch. I don't know if calling being a reporter is creative. It's the writing itch, I guess. Yeah, it can be. I mean, you don't make things up, but you do, try to figure out what angle you're going to come into a story from. So I did do that. And then I did some editing, which is, I think, the single biggest part of my career path that helped me be a writer, because it helped me learn to sacrifice parts of my writing for the sake of the story without being overly, sentimental about it. Because I feel like in my early, 20s and 30s when I was writing, it was, every word was just, I couldn't bear to cut it. And it wasn't until I became an editor that I realized how much stronger a good edit can make a book. So that's kind of what happened.
If I understand your past correctly, you kind of put your dreams of being a novelist on hold, like many people, because you were weighing the practicalities of, can I live as a novelist? There's real world concerns when you're a member of a family and things like that. But it was your children that kind of inspired you by their fearlessness too.
They did. My daughter is a musician. And actually, when I told her about the book deal, she said, hey, you're my role model. And I'm like, I wasn't already. But, it is true. When you're a creative type, you tend to sometimes get rid of your own aspirations in favor of practicality. And you put them aside and think, oh, this is a hobby. This is something I do, when I have time. And for instance, when I was writing No Bad Deed, I took a year off because I didn't have a deadline, and my son was getting ready to graduate from high school and my daughter was younger. And so I thought, I'm taking this time and I'm just spending time with family and doing the day job. And even after I was published, if I was meeting someone for the first time, and they ask, what do you do, for a living, I would give my day job as, oh, this is what I do, even though at the time I was making more from writing than I was from my day job. But it's just this thing that we have where I think a lot of creative types, where we don't value enough our creative process and our work. And, there are dishes to be done, there's a day job to do, as opposed to there's writing. It feels almost, and part of it I think is because it is such a huge part of who I am. It almost feels like pleasure. I mean, it almost doesn't, it feels like work, but it doesn't. And so when someone asks me what I do, most of the time I'll say, hey, I do this. And I'll mention my day job instead. And my daughter, if she's with me, she'll always say, tell them you're an author. What you lead with your writing. And so I do need to get better at that. Even now, working on book 3, even now I try to remind myself I'm an author.
You are. And your first book is Fabulous No Good Deed. It was inspired by something you saw when you were picking up your daughter at school. Is that correct?
Yes. My daughter, I was picking her up from after school care, and we were leaving the campus, and there was this young man who's probably about 14. He was walking across the grounds, and these 2 other boys about the same age just jumped him. They came across the grass, they just jumped him. And I had this moment of, what do I do? Do I call 911? How would I act differently if my daughter wasn't in the car? Which, if you've read No Bad Deed, you'll know that's kind of the opening line. And that thought just really stuck with me. And I didn't do anything because they scattered within seconds. I didn't even have time to make a conscious decision. I just kind of stopped the car and froze. And before I could even reach for my phone, or they were gone. And of course, then the writer in me is thinking, what happened before, that event? And of course, it was probably just they had beef with each other. But of course, I made these elaborate stories in my head, because that's what thriller writers do. We cling to the what if. And so that's ended up it's inspired the book.
For those that are not familiar, can you tell us just a little bit about the story to intrigue us?
Yeah, that this is there's a mom and veterinarian who's coming home late from a long shift, and she encounters a couple alongside the road. They're arguing, and then it turns into a physical fight. And, she calls 911, and then, against the operator's advice, she gets out of the vehicle. She doesn't intend to get close. She intends to keep her distance. She just wants to keep an eye on the situation. But then, through clumsiness and circumstance, she ends up there. And it turns into this, she's suddenly right there interceding. And the attacker warns her, if you let her die, I'll let you live. And then he takes off in her car, which has her address and the names of her children and her purse, everything like that. And then the next day, her husband disappears. And so she has to figure out, is this retribution? Is this connected in any way? And her life starts to unravel, and she starts to try to figure out what happened to her husband, and is it connected?
It's a fabulous book. I mean, it really pulls the reader in, because you have to stop and ask yourself, what would I do? I mean, how far would you go to protect someone you don't know versus the ones you love? I mean, how do you come up with those kind of ideas?
I know. And also, that the dynamic's different if your child's in the car.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question, because there's this hierarchy, where do you fit in protecting yourself versus protecting your children versus protecting someone else who's a stranger, but who is obviously in trouble. And also, you do have somewhat of a moral obligation, I think, to do what you can to help people who are obviously in a bad situation. And so, where do you put your own self-preservation instincts in that equation? So yeah, no, it was really, I still don't know. I think about that a lot. What would I do? And I think I might have ended up on the embankment looking over the side with my phone. But at one point, she throws a rock. I can see myself doing that. It's what would you do? It's just the what if situations have always fascinated me. What if this happened? With Blood Will Tell, the inspiration came a little differently, in that I had the relationship between the sisters was always the core of the story. Usually I'd come up with the what if, and then decide whose story it is to tell, and then go at it that way. But this time I did it kind of backwards, in that I knew I wanted to tell a story of sisters and what they would do for each other, and the obligation of self versus family, and what, when you're enabling someone versus actually doing them good. So that was really top of mind when I was coming up with this story. And so the premise came a little bit after, like when I was trying to think, how can I torture these sisters? How can I make it so that their relationship is tested? What is the story that would make this kind of status quo that they've established over the years kind of upend that? And so I was actually at a gas station and it clicked. So that's where the inspiration for that came from.
That's your new book, Blood Will Tell. Tell those listening in just a little bit about the story. It's about Frankie and Izzy.
Yes, Frankie's the older sister. Izzy's 6 years younger, and because of their parents, her father's was ill when Izzy was younger. So they did rely on Frankie a lot to help, and so she kind of feels almost maternal towards Izzy, and in a way that Izzy kind of wants her to be her sister, and Frankie kind of thinks, I'm your mom. It's a dynamic. It's a complicated dynamic. Anybody who's had a sister knows that can be a very complicated dynamic. And so she's at a gas station, pretty much, unconcerned about the day, other than this cryptic call she got from her sister's boyfriend saying that they needed to talk about something. And as she's at the gas station, this couple is just staring her down, and she can't figure out why they are so focused on her and seem to really not like her and be hostile towards her when she's never seen them before. And then a police cruiser pulls up behind her, and it turns out her truck is the subject of an Amber Alert. And it was spotted at the scene of a missing teen's abduction. And the only other person with access to her truck keys is her sister Izzy. So, and then also there's the matter of the fact that Izzy, was also tied to a missing persons case 5 years earlier when another teen girl went missing. So, this isn't the first time Izzy has gotten into trouble, and Frankie's felt the need to jump in and kind of figure out what is going on.
It's a really layered book because you do explore between the two sisters. On the one hand, you feel that obligation to a family member, a sister. On the other hand, if you know this person is not doing the right thing, is it better for you to turn them in? And do you know if they're actually guilty? You really have to explore all those angles. Do you get that in the first draft, or do you have to go back and kind of layer in those different elements?
I feel like a lot changes in the second draft. I feel like with me, editing is where you layer. The first draft is where you kind of get it all down and figure it out. And I write from an outline. I do veer off my outline quite a bit. There are some things that happen. It's kind of like I get lost on side streets. And sometimes I'll find an interesting new route to go, and it works out. But so the first draft's really about discovery, discovering the characters, because even if you look into their flaws and you do, character bios and try to kind of figure out who they are before you start the story, as they react to the circumstances of the story can change, the characters can change and evolve. So by the end of the book, there's always this thing like, okay, now I'm going back and I'm really looking at it from their perspectives now that I have a real handle on who they are, where the story is going. And yeah, so I do go back and layer stuff in, like there's a twist.
Yes.
And there is, there was stuff to support it. I always knew that was going to happen, but I realized it was a little too subtle. Because I want my readers to be surprised, but I don't want them to be confused. So I had to go back in and kind of hit it a little harder. So I am doing that in the editing process.
Let's talk a little about titles, because both of your books have almost spot on titles for conveying what the book is about. Did you come up with the titles? Do you work with your editor? What is your kind of approach to the product once you've written it? How do you package it?
That's a really good question. It was different with each book. With No Bad Deed, it was originally called The Good Samaritan. And like midway through draft one, I thought, no, this is not the title. And I came up with No Bad Deed, and it stuck. And I actually was kind of surprised by that, because I've heard, authors talk about titles getting changed, and, the publisher in sales and marketing, obviously they know what works and what doesn't. And so I was fully prepared for them to change it, the possibility of that. But I was also really attached to it, because it really did encapsulate what I wanted to say in the book. The fact that sometimes good people do good things and bad people do bad things. And just because you do the right thing, as Cassie does in the beginning of the book, doesn't mean the universe is going to reward you with rainbows and kittens. It's just not how the world works. And so I really like the title. With Blood Will Tell, I had about a dozen titles, none of which I loved. And that one was really harder to pin down. And that I will give full credit to my publisher. They are the ones who came up with that. They really wanted something that told the story, but also hinted at the sisters being the heart of it, the blood, and it kind of works on a couple different levels on this, but, kinship and sibling relationships is huge in many ways in the story. So it really does, I think, encapsulate what the book is about. So they did a great job with that. I was lost.
Well, you're definitely right, spot on. For The Good Samaritan would be a completely different book. If I saw that in a bookstore, I would not think crime fiction, suspense fiction.
Right.
It's an Oprah book club pick or something like that. So yeah, that's fascinating. Let's go back a little bit. You worked as a reporter, as a journalist, and one of the things that I found fascinating that I think you said was you enjoyed working as a journalist because you always got the facts of the crime, but not the why. When you're a novelist, that allows you to explore that angle.
Yes, when you're a journalist, you're really, if it was a great job to have, if you are interested in being an author, because it exposes you to so much about what goes on in the world, about how people act, but you don't get the why. You get the facts of the case. Sometimes you'll get what they say is the why, but the difference between being a novelist and being a reporter is one thing, you get to make things up. That's the obvious difference. The other obvious difference to me is that you have access to places that a journalist can go, and like you can get inside people's homes, inside their thoughts, and you get to explore what you think maybe triggered them to act in a certain way and potentially hurt somebody they love or do something unthinkable. And so I was kind of inspired by my career as a journalist, but I wanted to take it further. I wanted to get into those deep, dark places we usually don't have access to.
I don't know if it's true for you, but I also think that writers who come from a journalism background or a newspaper background, it also teaches you how to write, because you don't have the luxury of waiting for the muse to strike. You're kind of
yeah, deadline's a thing for sure. And also being an editor, that helped me learn that not every word that I created was art that must be protected at all costs. It was like I really did grow by learning to edit, because for the sake of the story, like No Bad Deed, I ended up, like I said, I started from an outline. It was originally third person, 3 points of view from Carver, Brooklyn, and Cassie. And then I realized that Brooklyn and Carver were getting all the interesting parts. And I really wanted my protagonist to be more active, and also it was her story to tell. And so in draft 1.5, probably, I threw out 2/3 of the book and made it a first person from Cassie's point of view. And it evolved. It was not, I would say maybe 15, 20% maybe stayed from the first draft. But the story was still the same, and the same things happened. It was just a totally different dynamic. And if I hadn't been an editor, I don't think I would have been as ready to do that, because it's so hard. When I edited my first 3 books, so the reason that I think they probably never did get published was, and by not get published, meaning I didn't feel they were ready to query, is because, I would polish them by looking over the grammar and making sure the word choice was right. But, the big picture stuff, it was hard to really know how to take a look at that from the inside. And then once I became an editor, I was able to look at my work, I think, a little bit more objectively. And I think it helped me find my voice in a way that I hadn't before. So yeah, it definitely helped me the career in multiple ways, both as a reporter and as an editor.
I'm guessing, but I think it's probably lucky that as one of your previous careers, it's good you did work as a journalist, because if you were working in any other kind of an office and you asked your coworkers, how would I kill someone? They might look at you a little bit oddly.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it reminds me, about a month ago, my daughter suggested that we have this get to know you dinner with her best friend and her parents, because I'd met her best friend many times. But we'd only met her parents in passing. And so we decided we were going to all get together for dinner, the parents and the adult children. So we met, and I was getting to know her, and she mentioned what city she was from. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I have a really good friend from Benicia. And oh, she is so great. I mean, like, whenever I need to figure out where to bury a body or how best to kill someone, she's like one of the 2 people that I routinely text and figure out how to do that. And my daughter whispers, leans over and whispers, "Mom, she doesn't know you're a writer." And it was funny seeing her expression change when she heard my daughter. She's like, because she was like, had this really like kind of confused expression on her face. And then she's like, "Oh, okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I get it now. You're not crazy." So.
You talked a little bit about your voice, or what some publishers like to call an author's brand. For someone who's new to you, how would you describe your writing, if you had to?
I tend to write, my story is always going to have a heart of some kind, probably going to be family or relationship driven. And by relationship, I mean, it could be the relationship between,
Siblings or parents?
sisters. It could be, loved one friendship, but it would be something on a deeper level, because you have to read your book so many times as an author, that I feel like if I don't have a deep emotional connection to it in some way, it's going to be really hard to read it that 10th, 12th, 30th time. And so, it's always going to have a heart. It's always going to have, it's always going to be a standalone, probably. I mean, some people have asked me if I'd ever do a series. I think if I found the right character, but I do like it, that story of the average person being put in a situation that they're not equipped to deal with, both emotionally and physically, that all of a sudden their life is threatened. I like personal stakes. I really love, there's a lot of police procedurals that I love, but I don't think I could write that, because I like that intimate, and I do have police characters, and actually a retired police lieutenant that always is my sounding board for those, investigative scenes. But as far as from perspective or POV, it's probably always going to have that personal stakes, and strong female characters are kind of my brand, I would say, too.
Well, in some ways, it's almost Hitchcockian suspense, because it is the average person that gets caught up in some kind of drama or things like that. So your first book was No Good Deed. You wrote that, and then you had to write Blood Will Tell. Was there a difference in writing the 2 books between your first and your second, or was it the same process, or did all of a sudden?
They were both really easy and done quickly.
Yes, I'm sure out there aspiring writers are sharpening their knives.
Book one was, I didn't have an expectation that anybody would read it. I've said this before, I wrote in a bubble. I had one friend who read an early draft with that third person 3 POV book. But other than that, the first person who read it in its entirety, the way that it was submitted, was my agent. He was the first person. And I didn't go to writers' conferences. I didn't have critique groups, or, it was just, I wrote very much when I felt like it, at football games, on my lunch break, whatever. I would find the moments, but it wasn't as disciplined about it. And then I revised at my leisure. Nobody else was expecting it or whatever. And then with book two, I suddenly had a deadline and expectations, and also maybe a little teeny bit got in my own head. And I knew the relationship, but the plot evolved. And I actually wrote a book, revised a book, gave my editor the first 50 pages, and start again, and did it all over again. And it's definitely the book I wanted to tell. And it's not that much different than the processes for book one and book three that I'm working on now. I do tend to, like I said, write that first draft. I outline, write the first draft. But with this one, it was under a microscope. So it was different. I got to the place I wanted to be, but there were just more eyes on me when I was doing it. So, it was different. I kind of think of book one as finding my voice, and book two as finding my process. Oh. Refining my process, I should say, what works for me and what doesn't.
I know you may not want to talk a lot about it, but you did mention you're working on something, so we can hope for another book from you.
I am, and I'm not ready to announce yet, but there will be a book three, and I hope you love it as much as I do.
Let's switch gears a little bit, because I know you mentioned that Dean Koontz was one of your favorite authors. Have you read things recently that you'd like to share with others, and what may be on your summer reading list this year?
My most recent books that I read were, I'm a little behind. Let's just start there. So I have a mix of really new books and books that have been out a while that are, 2021 was not a good reading year for me. So 2022, I vowed would be better. And I'm really trying to make that so. I just recently read The Last Flight by Julie Clark, which I absolutely loved, and Verity by Colleen Hoover. Little books like that, everyone's heard. And then I'm a sucker for a sister book. So on my TBR list is Kelly Garrett's Like a Sister. And then also, I don't normally read outside my genre, but I have been more lately, and I'm really looking forward to The Soviet Sisters by Annika Scott, which is historical fiction, and that will be out this summer as well. And I just started Watch Out for Her by Samantha Bailey. That's the one I'm currently reading. And I think the other one that I'm going to read coming up is The Island by Adrienne McKenty, because I absolutely love the chain. I love high concept hooky books that also have heart. I guess is kind of where
that's your brand.
Yeah, I mean, that was a quicker way of saying it, wasn't it? I told you I couldn't write short stories. Apparently I can't write pitches either.
Well, I can't believe how quickly our time has already flown by. Before we run out, if readers want to learn more about you and your books, do you have social media platforms you frequent? How can they find out more?
I do. I have a website, easy to remember, heatherchavez.com. So anything you can find there. And then I'm on Instagram and Twitter as IAM HR Chavez. And then I'm on Facebook as under my name.
Well, I want to thank Heather for taking time to be with us today and talk about her books, No Good Deed and Blood Will Tell. And I'd like to thank everyone who's been tuning in and listening to another virtual author event at the Poison Pen Bookstore. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.